Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of the philosophical assumptions and problems that underlie cognitive science. So we'll start this discussion with Thomas Hobbes and Rene Descartes, and they have sort of two different ways of thinking about the mind. Uh, Thomas Hobbes was kind of a monist, and monism is the idea that the brain and the mind are one entity, whereas dualism is more in line with how Rene Descartes thinks, which is that the mind and the brain are separate. So these aren't actual quotes from Thomas Hobbes and Rene Descartes, but they're ways to summarize their arguments. So I think these are both philosophers from the Enlightenment era, and they're sort of following the scientific tradition that comes from, or that was sort of more prominent during the Renaissance era. Thomas Hobbes is basically saying, in a not so eloquent way, that we are simply meat machines and our brains are like meat machines. So our brains are meat machines. And the idea was that we should try to explain things using physical explanations. And therefore, we're kind of machines that operate according to mechanical rules. That was the idea. And if that's the case, that we're simply machines, then it should, in principle, we should be able to understand how the mind works or to understand cognition in principle. And I don't know if he said this, but one thing that follows from this is that if that's the case, right, if we can understand how cognition works, then we should be able to create genuine artificial intelligence. So if we could figure out all the rules and the mechanisms and processes involved in the mind, how the mind works, then we should just be able to program all those rules and make a computer do the same thing, and we would have genuine artificial intelligence. So Rene Descartes disagreed. He did endorse the view that the brain must work mechanically, just like Thomas Hobbes did, and following the scientific tradition. However, he would say that the reason we can think is because we have a mind which is separate from the brain. So, in contrast to how the brain works, we can understand the meaning of symbols, which is required for thinking to happen. So, a computer can manipulate symbols, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they understand what those symbols are. And so if you're just manipulating symbols, then you're not really thinking in the way that Rene Descartes would say. So the blind manipulation of symbols is not really thinking according to Descartes. And Descartes would say, obviously I'm a thinking being, right? And so if I'm a thinking being, then there must be more to it than simple manipulation of symbols. And he concluded that the mind is separate from the brain and therefore immaterial. So I think he would say that you could study the brain, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're studying thinking or how the mind works. So as such, we can't study the mind. We we can't, according to him, we can't study the mind because science can only study things in the physical world, and the mind is not physical; it's immaterial. Therefore, we can't study it. And I believe that Descartes is basically equating the mind with the soul. And most cognitive scientists, I would say, probably agree with Thomas Hobbes in the sense that the mind cannot exist without the brain, and everything that the mind does is because of the brain. But I would also say that we kind of take many cognitive scientists probably take a middle ground in the sense that it's true that the mind comes from the brain. So in a sense, we are meat machines, but the mind is also like an emergent property, an emergent entity that comes from the brain. So just how software is separate from hardware, but you need hardware in order for the software to work in the same way, the mind is separate from the brain, but it's not like it's immaterial. It's just sort of like an emergent thing that stems from the brain. So in a sense, we kind of take a middle ground between Descartes and Hobbes. And I don't think many cognitive scientists would argue or entertain the idea that we have souls, that the mind is a soul, but they would maybe say that it's a separate entity in its own right. Okay, with that being said, the idea from the scientific tradition was to explain things mechanically with physical explanations. And so, following that tradition, cognition was no different. We wanted to understand how the mind works using some sort of mechanical explanation. And all a mechanism needs in order to operate is the physical properties of its parts and its inputs. So when you wind up a clock, you are in some sense giving it its input, and the parts will work to keep the time. And so, what is a mechanism? A mechanism is a system that operates only in terms of its physical properties and only in terms of the physical properties of its parts and inputs. So this is like the gears of a watch, an analog watch, not a digital watch. And a watch has a certain number of gears or parts, and those parts have physical properties to them. And if you wind up the watch, then it'll keep the time based on how the parts interact with each other. So the parts interact in a way that keeps time given the input. So the input is you winding up the clock, and the parts interact to keep that time, and keeping the time is kind of like the output. So not uh, so right. So we not only do we want to explain the mind using a mechanical explanation, but we want to do so in a way that avoids making the homuncular fallacy. And the idea behind the homuncular fallacy is that when trying to explain something like, let's say, vision, right, one might say, well, how do we see things? Well, you could say that there's a little person or entity, which is called a homunculus. And that homunculus or that entity is inside the brain that perceives the world and watches what we see or makes decisions for us that basically, it's basically doing all the cognition for us. Um, right. However, this begs the question of if there's, a homunculus inside of us, inside of our minds that perceive, then how does that homunculus perceive? And if the homunculus is watching, then don't we need another homunculus inside the homunculus, that homunculus, and then another homunculus inside that homunculus? And this basically creates an infinite chain of homunculi. And so the fallacy refers to an error in which reasoning reasoning in which one tries to explain something by asserting something that also needs the same level of explanation. And so it doesn't really explain anything by asserting a homunculus. By asserting a homunculus, you're simply shifting the problem of explanation. You're sort of kicking the can down the road, right? And rather than trying to explain how we perceive, now we have to explain how the homunculus perceives, and then how that homunculus perceives, and so on and so forth. So this illustrates the need to explain complex phenomena such as cognition using simpler processes rather than something basically as equally complex. And so in the next, oh, sorry. So the idea is that that cognition should be explained using a number of simpler mechanisms for which the complexity emerges from the interaction of simpler mechanisms or parts. Okay, so in the next video, we'll elaborate on this more, on the idea of mechanisms and how that invites, the mechanistic view, and how that invites a whole host of additional problems as well.